essentially personalised prevention initiatives that rely on genomics are in a challenging position because genomics is extremely powerful for diagnosis, but in a more tricky situation when it comes to prediction. And part of the reason for that is that when it comes to predicting rare disease, we've got a lot of noise in our genomes, and we've all got some stuff that's very rare and it's hard to know what to make of. We've got some stuff that looks like it would, in theory, rep what the gene is trying to do, and some stuff that is in a disease database as disease causing somewhere. And if you find this kind of thing in a healthy adult, it's relatively easy to feel reassured that it's not going to cause a pervasive developmental disorder. If you find it in a newborn baby, it's a bit harder to immediately be so reassuring about it. On the other end of the spectrum, it's also challenging using genomics to predict common disease, partly because such a high proportion of our risk factors for common disease aren't genetic. And the upshot of that is that in diseases like breast cancer or heart disease, most of the people who become affected by those diseases won't have a high polygenic risk. And essentially, there are lots of kind of subtleties and caveats to using genomics in risk prediction, and personalised prevention initiatives are probably most likely to flourish if everybody is expecting that, so prepared for uncertainty and not likely to interpret results as meaning more than they actually do. But to what extent will people be prepared for that? The ways we develop our expectations are complex, and there's lots of evidence which shows that people don't just take exactly what the media says to determine their attitudes towards things. But that said, for things like genomics, the media is probably going to be a big source of information for a lot of people, especially if they're not of an age where they were taught about it in school, for example. And lots of the work that's done this to date has kind of showed that the way that genetics and genomics is discussed in the media often presents it as being quite clear-cut, quite powerful, going to give you important answers. But a lot of the research done to date has mainly focused on text, and often they've done things like excluding articles with a low word count on the premise that there can't have been that much in-depth discussion about genomics. And while there's truth to that, I think for a lot of people for whom genomics isn't personally relevant at this stage, who might not be interested to click on and read an article, actually probably the headline and the little thumbnail image is the main thing they'll see. And at the point at which genomics does become personally relevant to them, perhaps in the context of a personalised prevention initiative, what sort of messages will they have been exposed to? So I decided to look at how genetics and genomics were kind of shown in stock image banks. And stock image banks are basically kind of repositories of images that people create that are then sold on to anyone who wants to use them to illustrate an article. So, for example, news outlets will quite often use a stock image to illustrate an article about anything. And if you kind of are looking on whatever news app you use, often you'll see kind of Getty Images or Shutterstock or something in little letters at the bottom of the image, and that shows you that that image has been bought from a stock image bank. It's a surprisingly big industry. It was worth $3 billion in 2020, and to be successful, or to be chosen for an article, a stock image has to look like it really is a good match for the article. But to make money, there had to be a lot of articles that feel that way about it. And the upshot is that the most successful stock images often tend to kind of conform to existing cliches. So like, you know, someone sitting on a sofa with a laptop for a story about working from home, for example. So I decided to look at how genetic and genomic tests were represented in stock image banks. And my approach was quite kind of very influenced by this article by Harvey and Brooks, who were the first to look at a health-related topic in a stock image banks, and their kind of subject was dementia. But they basically envisage stock images as visual texts culminating from a system of deliberate and motivated design choices made by their producers. And they kind of take a two-tier approach to the analysis. So first off, you kind of look at the image, what is in it, how is it lit, what's the main focus of the image on, and then you next consider kind of what messages are conveyed by those choices as to how to kind of compose the image. So I collected images from Getty Images and Adobe Stock, which I chose on the basis of being kind of big, well-used stock image banks. I used the search term genetic test because I was trying to think of like what quick kind of thing someone might be using to pick something to illustrate an article. Within each bank, I ranked images by relevance or best match to select the top 50. And the reason I did that as opposed to most popular or most downloaded was because those I got a huge number of generic laboratory scenes, and it was probably that those would apply to many more articles than that they'd be particularly likely to be chosen to illustrate something about genomics. Each image was analysed by myself and Leah Boyle, and we discussed it at various points with our supervisors, Susie Weller and Anna Kalukason, and in our wider research group as well. And in terms of the things that came out of it, only 7% of the images featured somebody who was themselves having a genetic test. And they were usually portrayed in this kind of very passive way. So it was like an arm having a blood test, or a sort of mouth having a cheek swab without even the eyes shown. But in contrast, people involved in delivering genetic tests were present in a lot of the images, and usually wearing stuff that very much emphasised a sort of technical role. So like a really gleaming white coat and goggles and gloves, or scrubs and a stethoscope. But even in those, though they were in many more of the images, they were generally sort of subsidiary to the equipment or something that they were holding. So sometimes you just see gloved hands or fingertips, and generally the focus of the image was on whatever they were holding, not on the person themselves. There weren't any instances where someone was looking directly at the camera. In contrast, the equipment was sort of often the focal point of the image. So 39% of images featured pipettes and droppers, potentially kind of evoking ideas of immediacy and accuracy and precision. And a lot kind of the pipette images had this little droplet on the end as the focal point of the whole image. And I'm very grateful to Esther and David who took that picture for me. 19% of images featured a microscope, which was perhaps a bit surprising given that to my understanding they're not used that much in contemporary genetic tests, but it kind of evokes ideas maybe of like deep scrutiny and really searching. In terms of how data was treated in the images, it was typically represented in this sort of way. So again, leaning on kind of older technology, perhaps like kind of slab gel electrophoresis type barcodey bands with some glowing bits, rather than loads of A's and C's and G's and things like that. And again, perhaps this might be kind of familiar to people from watching like crime dramas with DNA fingerprinting or that kind of thing. But yeah, again, it was older technologies that were sort of showing up in the banks. And lastly, 23% of images featured a double helix. My kind of app on my phone with like where you ask it to do things made this picture for me, but often a lot of them were kind of had sparkly edges or sparkles coming out of them. And I thought it did kind of tap into stuff that's been discussed for decades in the literature about how DNA is sort of culturally seen as similar to the soul in terms of it's like connected to our body, but it lives beyond us. It's seen as relevant to questions about destiny and morality and all that kind of thing. And I think certainly lots of the stock images kind of went with that narrative. So to summarise, I think the images that I was seeing in these stock image banks potentially invited people to expect more clarity and power from genetics than might be likely to be the case when using it to predict disease. And generally, emphasis was very much on the technical, and the role of people in kind of living with the results of these or being involved in the construction of these results was really minimised. People were kind of, just doing what the technology told them. Now, why does this matter? I guess I think it matters because these images used to illustrate news stories that we're all reading do communicate messages about genetics, whether they are kind of intended to or not. And some of these commonly used pictures are perhaps would invite people to maybe expect more power, more excitement, more precision, more clarity from genetic and genomic testing that might be the case, particularly in the context of things where trying to use genomics in a public health way to predict quite subtle changes in a person's risk. So just to raise the question, are there other representations we could usefully bring into conversations about genetic and genomic tests? I really hope that QR code goes to the article. That was the theory. But if you wanted to read more about it, it's in, we published it last year in this. Thank you.